Well, welcome to the latest episode following the restoration of our 2-foot gauge 1924 Fowler locomotive. Today is a boiler edition following what we've done so far to the boiler in preparation for it to go away for shot blasting. This is looking at the drawings. The firebox is where you'll see us working first, and we move straight to Dave bashing some of the tubes out from the firebox end. You may remember from the last episode that this is a really hard job. The tubes are in really good condition and they are expanded out from their original diameter to squash into the front tube plate. But they haven't been expanded very much, so the actual thickness, the actual diameter, the outside diameter of the tube is not that much smaller than the actual hole that we're trying to get it through here. And with the build-up of a slight little bit of salt and a little bit of surface rust on there, and the fact that the tube is still ostensibly really solid and in good condition, means that we really had to work hard to drag them out through that tube plate. You see there looking down through the dome, and again this is with the camera inside the boiler looking through the dome, looking forwards at the tube plate, and you can see Jenny wiggling that tube to try and keep it moving and to try and get it free as the turfer is pulled to try and drag them out through the tube plate. There's 85 tubes in total, and of course we ground off the peened over section, as you perhaps remember from an earlier video in the firebox, before we bashed them out of there and then pulled them through. It's spread over several days, this, because obviously it was too much hard work and too long to do in a day, as you can see there. One of the other things we had to do while the tubes are being dragged out, this is looking down on the top of the boiler in through the dome hole. As you can see on the drawing, this is what it looks like in reality. We were trying to get the regulator rod, which is what this is, out through the back head. But obviously the crank here that operates the regulator linkage was just seized solidly on there. So we tried heating it up, we tried all sorts of things, and in the end we had to cut through with an angle grinder to create a slit in the actual crank itself, and then hit it with a hammer, as you can see John doing here, to try and split it and break it off the rod, which eventually we managed to do. And this is then John removing the rod itself out through the hole where the regulator gland fits in the back head. The rod itself is in fine condition, so we'll be reusing that again. But the key, the chock that's in it that you see John bashing out here, is gnarled and beyond repair, so that will get renewed. And the crank itself, you'll see here, has seen its fair share of beating over the years, so we'll probably make a new one of them rather than trying to reuse it. And back up to the dome again. This is John with the burning tackle out again, removing a bracket that holds the regulator housing to the main steam pipe that takes the steam from the regulator to the cylinders. The clasp itself just grips the two together, and this is looking from the firebox tube plate out towards the front of the engine. You can see the bolts being burned away. If we look from the other side as well, from the front tube plate looking back, you can see the bracket itself around the big steam pipe. Again, we're just taking the bolts out because they were seized up and rusted away, and we'll retain the clasps for reuse. Back to fighting with the tubes now. As you can see, there's been a little bit of progress made there since the last look at the front tube plate. We're down to the last 20 or so here. As you can see, this me in the firebox with Dave hitting with a big sledgehammer on the end, because it just takes such a lot of force to try and break some of these tubes out of the tube plate. This is again looking right at the tube, which you can see there, just starting to free there from the tube plate, pushing with Dave hitting on the outside, and out it goes. So that's it, that one out, to be pushed right through to the point where we can grab it with the turf on the other end.
Two more.
We were bashing them out from the firebox end until there was about 8 inches visible at the tube plate, which gave us enough to get hold of with the puller. Again, more and more out each time. This is back to the very last one or two, and in fact I'll leave you to watch the last tube come out.
So close. Here it comes. Yay. Have a cheer.
So back again looking at the dome, and this is how we physically got me inside the boiler to clean it out. So if I flip the image round, you can look at the dome in the same orientation that it is in the next photograph. Now, looking in through the dome, there are 5 longitudinal stays attaching the front tube plate, there's one of them, to the back head, there's the second and the third, and they were basically about 4 inches apart physically for getting something between, which obviously I couldn't get between. So we put these scissor jacks in there to bend them apart just ever so slightly, not doing any harm to them, but just spreading them apart a little bit so that there's enough of a gap for me to squeeze between. Once inside the barrel, it was a case of clearing up the years of debris that's accumulated since the 60s. Rust, dead leaves, hopefully dead, scarily poisonous Australian spiders, that kind of thing. If we look up here, you can see the steam pipe, the main steam pipe there that we're going to be looking at next, because removing that from the boiler was the next phase of getting it prepared for shot blasting. If you look at the drawing, you can see that the pipe goes through and it sits into a bush there on the front tube plate. Now, the bush was really tightly into the tube plate, so it was a case of pulling and hitting on it with a wooden shield in the way, and this is just the last part of the process that you see here where we'd loosened it enough to get it free. So you see me testing it there with my hand because we'd previously heated it to try and get it free. So this is a case of pulling it through there.
I've got it.
Got it? Go on then. It'll need to be square. It'll need to be square, yeah. Now, even as it happens, once we managed to get it square and lined up with the hole, it was still too tight a fit to get it through, and this was another case where we had to create a dolly there. And as you see, when I look through one of the tube holes in the tube plate, they've got the puller on it again to try and really drag it out. And then even with force on that, with several tons force on that, we still had to hit the dolly to try and push it out. But like everything else, we got there eventually and out it came. Now, back to the drawing again. If you imagine me kneeling inside the barrel right there and looking that way, you'll be able to see the view of the firebox with all the tube holes in it. And we're going to go inside the boiler now and have a little bit of assessment. I'm drawing the line there with my finger of where the stays are. So this is looking from that position back at the inner firebox. You can see the holes where the tubes have been removed. Up the stays that you can see are slightly bent there to get me through in the first place. And then looking at the end of the stays. Now, this is the crucial thing. If you look at the end there, the threads are still visible and the stay is hardly wasted at all. It's almost in perfect condition, as is the tube plate here, where you can see that there's loads of meat and really crisp edges to it. So good news so far. Now, kneeling in the bottom of the barrel at the firebox end, looking toward the camera, this is the left-hand side gap between the inner firebox and the outer, looking at all these stays that link the 2 large flat areas together and make them structurally sound. We're going to look from the top of the radius there of the inner firebox, and we're going to work our way down looking at the stay threads. So here you can see that radius, and then you start to see the stays. As you can see, all the threads are still visible. There's loads of good meat on there. They're a little bit rusty, but there's no structural wear on those at all, so we're pretty confident that the boiler inspector will be very happy with those. And then if we go sitting in the same place and we continue our way around, if we look down over into the gap between the front of the inner firebox and the outer throat plate, kneeling there and looking over the edge into the slot down there, we can see the stays in that area to see if they're any good, because that's an area where debris and rust usually accumulates. So we'd expect to find them a little worse down here. So looking down, the first one that we see is a little worse, and if I brush it a little with my hands, you can see it's got some wear on the threads. But moving across toward the centre where more debris gathers, you can see that the threads have gone off that stay, and the one to the left of it as well. However, the meat of the material of the stay is still there, still strong. The only thing that's rusted away and gone is the actual thread itself. So we're going to ask a boiler inspector for a view on that, of whether they're good enough to leave for another 10 years. I suspect they might be, but again, we may have to replace them. Move round now to the gap up the right hand side of the firebox. Obviously it looks to the left because we're looking backwards. Up to the top of the firebox crown there. They all look just the same as the other side, so all good there. Moving back to the drawing, we're going to look now at the crown stays, which are the vertical stays that tie the flat surface of the inner firebox to the barrel top to give it again structural strength. And again, you can see these are rusty, but they're actually strong. The material is still pretty much the same diameter and thickness as it ever was when it went in there. There's very little wear on those. And as we look down towards the base of them, you'll see that the base of them is fatter slightly where it comes to its threads and goes into the crown. That's a good sign that they're pretty much as they were put in, if a little bit uglier, but structurally just as good. Time to get out, I think. Go for a good cup of tea.
We haven't got any 9-inch sitting discs.
And moving on to taking some of the studs out from the back head. This is one of the 4 studs that holds the casting onto the back head that supports the firehole doors. This one we had to heat with the burner first and then hit it with a hammer and then quench it to shrink it quickly to shock it free from the back head. We tried that technique with lots of them, and some were successful, but others simply sheared off because they were too rusted and thinned. And so for those ones we had to chop them off with an angle grinder and then dot punch the centre and drill them out to get them free. This is Ian taking one of the studs out from the 2 pads on the back head that hold the injectors. This is the left hand one. Again, we weren't lucky with that, so it had to be dot punched and drilled out. Afterwards it'll be re-tapped with a fresh thread so that it's good to take the new studs. The little ring of studs that held the regulator gland in were actually quite good, but they weren't perfect, and it's one of the areas where you don't want to mess around. You've got a big volume, essentially a bomb, in that boiler, so you want really good strong fresh meat on the threads so that you know that your fittings are all going to be solidly onto that boiler. Even things like this, which is the little brackets that go on the top of the barrel to hold the sandbox castings on, they don't hold any steam, but they do go into the boiler, so we decided to angle grind them off. We'll be dot punching and drilling them out and rethreading them to make them solid, sound and new material. Well, that's pretty much it for the boiler before it goes off for shot blasting, so the next time you see it, it all ought to be shiny and new and ready for the boiler inspector. Thanks again for watching. There'll be another video along shortly.